Hello and welcome, my name is Chris from christopherholt.com and welcome to this video presentation. What we're going to be looking at is low back pain and diet, and as you can see on the screen, with a little bit more emphasis on inflammation. Now, first of all, I'll describe sort of what inflammation is, so I'll be using this slide for that. Then we're going to look at inflammation and low back pain a little bit more specifically, and then finally, come the end, we are going to be looking at foods that increase inflammation and foods that reduce inflammation. And then just at the end, there's a little reference list as to where I've got this information from, so you can be nice and confident that I'm just not making it up as I go along. So, inflammation itself. So inflammation is the body's attempt at self-protection, the aim being to remove harmful stimuli, including damaged cells, irritants or pathogens, to begin the healing process. So that's the main thing to remember with inflammation, that in the initial stages it's there to help and begin the healing process. The problem comes as it gets prolonged, and I'll come on to that in a second. So next, inflammation is a part of the body's immune response. Initially, it is beneficial when, for example, your knee sustains a blow and tissues need care and protection. So the exact same is happening in your back. So obviously it's described there when your knee takes a blow, but when your body becomes your lower back becomes strained, the exact same can happen. So your tissues, your muscles, your ligaments, your tendons, they can become inflamed as sort of a protective mechanism around your back, and I'll talk about a cause of that specific to low back pain in the next slide. So next, however, sometimes inflammation can cause further inflammation. It can become self-perpetuating. More inflammation is created in a response to the existing inflammation, and this is where diet comes in, and this is where the healing process as a whole comes in, and how diet helps that healing process. Because as you've just heard there, that if inflammation sticks around, it can cause more inflammation. So again, it can be that self-perpetuating cycle of inflammation brings further inflammation. So what we need to do as a population, as people who suffer with low back pain, and again, low back pain is there to, open to everyone at any time. It's not just people who have got low back pain. But what it can do is, because of that previous injury, there can be leftover inflammation that's there, or there can be damaged tissue that's always there if we don't heal the tissue properly. And that's again where the diet comes in. So if we can properly heal the tissue, the inflammation will go away. And there are other mechanisms for that. Diet isn't just one of them, but diet does bring the nutrition and the structures or the components that we need to help in that healing process and help heal the tissues sort of properly. Because if we're not bringing in the proper nutrients, then the tissue's never going to heal properly, if that makes sense. So that's inflammation as a whole. What we're now going to look at is inflammation a little bit more specific to low back pain. So I will click through to the next slide, and we'll get on with that one. So inflammation and low back pain. In the 3 bullet points that we've got up here, I've put a very sort of general progression of inflammation. So just very basic, simple, let's say starter inflammation, to a more slightly long-lasting inflammation as we go through. And you can see the 3 different conditions on there in the 3 bullet points. So low back pain itself can be due to tissue inflammation. So inflammation of the muscle, the ligaments, or the tendons, so it could be all 3, it could be 2 of them, it could just be 1 of them. So low back pain initially will start with some degree of tissue inflammation, and that can be caused by, let's say, being too stationary or being too active, or even going from being very stationary to very active. So for instance, sitting in a seat all day for 8 hours and then going to the gym in the evening. So those sort of polar opposites or extremes can cause a tissue inflammation. So obviously the solution to that is, as I've talked about in many other of my videos, is just bringing moderation to how much you sit and how much you move to make it easier on the joints and the tissues. But with regards to inflammation, that's how it can begin. And then what it can do is it can then progress into in later life into something like arthritis, which is an inflammation of the joint where the joint isn't able to manage itself and lubricate itself, and then it becomes inflamed due to friction or lack of nutrients coming to the joint. And then eventually that can progress into something. Now you'll have to excuse me on the pronunciation. I'm still getting used to these words, but ankylosing spondylitis. I'm 99% sure I've got that pronunciation correct, but please don't. The spelling's right, but please don't get me on the pronunciation. But basically, they are all progressions, or they all can be progressions of one another. That's not to say that your back pain is going to go down that route, but low back pain, just general low back pain, can get worse throughout time, and it can move into arthritis, and then it can move into ankylosing spondylitis. So we have to be aware of that progression. So when we get either of those three conditions, first of all we have to know that there's a progression to it, but also we have to understand each of those progressions themselves. Not to say that it's just those three, because there are more, but we have to be aware of that there is a progression. So that's how the inflammation can begin. So what we need to start doing is we need to start bringing an understanding of how we can reduce inflammation. And one of the ways that we can reduce inflammation is using our diet. Now there are more things like massage and other treatments of tissues, i.e. chiropractic, osteopathy, and so on and so forth. But diet is one of them. And again, we have to be aware, because then we can start to sort of self-treat, if that makes sense. Now again, it may not get rid of the whole problem, because you may need to release some tissue through massage, osteopathy, chiropractic, whatever it may be. So first of all, we have to understand that diet is a part of it. And what we're now going to start doing is we're going to start looking at diet and inflammation. So we've looked at inflammation and low back pain. Now it's inflammation and diet in the next slide. So what I'll do is I'll click through and we'll get started. Inflammation and diet. First of all, let me just go into the quote or the phrase that I've taken from a book. There is a strong relationship between our Western diet and inflammation. Over the last century, food practices have changed such that we are increasingly exposed to inflammatory foods. And not only is it the food itself, but it's how the food has been produced that can cause inflammation. Way back when, in 75 to 100 years ago, when foods weren't, let's say, mass produced, they were produced in bakeries and in butchers and so on and so forth, but they weren't as processed, they weren't as refined, which has made them that much more sort of inflammatory or toxic to our body. So when we have, let's say, inflammation of a tissue, so we've been too active or not active enough, or we're going from the extremes from inactivity to overactivity, that puts a stress on the tissue. When we then take in our food, because that's toxic, and because, let's say, pain or injury or inflammation will go to the weakest part of the body, that toxicity is then going to go to that weakened place, and it's going to express itself through that, which is then going to cause potentially more inflammation, lead on to arthritis, lead on to further sort of more specific back conditions. So if we can, in a way, change the way we eat different foods, reduce the toxicity, reduce the inflammatory foods, then what we're going to do, then those healing foods, let's call them, are going to go to where the inflammation is, and it's going to help aid that healing process that we talked about in the first slide. So the main thing that we need to take from these slides are the different foods that are in a way causing inflammation and the foods that are reducing inflammation. And that's what we're going to start looking at in the next couple of slides. So we'll go to the next slide where we're going to look at foods that increase inflammation, and we can start talking a little bit further about these the westernized diet and sort of how this inflammation pandemic, epidemic, however you want to describe it, has come about. Here we have foods that increase inflammation. So it's not about eliminating these foods, but it's about drastically reducing them and eating them not all together, but eating them very sparingly. So foods that increase inflammation are fast foods, meats, dairy, white foods, sugary foods, and that goes for all different sugary foods, baked goods, cakes, croissants, different cakes, all those different types of nice foods that people enjoy. And the final one, alcohol. Now, because these foods are so readily available, the whole moderation aspect of diet is being taken way out of context, where everyone thinks they can eat in moderation, so they can eat all these different foods, but because they are eating all of these different foods, that moderation isn't really that moderate. It's quite, in a way, you could say, extreme. So we have to look at what we eat, the fast foods, the amount of meat, the amount of dairy, the white foods, the sugary foods, and the alcohol. We need to look at that as a whole. We can't just say, well, I only go out to eat once a week. I only eat a little piece of meat every single day. I only have milk on my cereal in the morning. We have to look at it as a whole, because as we look at it as a whole, we can see how they accumulate, and we can see what ratio we're eating them in with regards to foods that reduce inflammation. So we have to take a slightly broader look at our diet and how regularly we are eating these foods and how much of these foods that we are eating regularly, because in most pre-packed food or sandwiches or ready meals, they will have some meat in it. There's a good chance there could be some cheese in it. White foods like white rices, white pasta, white bread, all those different foods, they're highly refined. And again, they take out all the nutrients and only leave the starchy part of the food, which gives it the white color. So we have to look at how the white foods, how much white foods are affecting how we eat. Sugar is in everything from soft drinks to cakes to baked goods to even bread. And again, we have to look at and be very honest about how much sugar we are taking in, because it's in, well, we could be adding it to cereal. It's in dairy. Obviously, the milk sugar is lactose. So sugar is absolutely everywhere. And then the final one being alcohol. And alcohol, again, can have a lot of sugar in it, but again, it has a lot of yeast. It has a lot of alcohol itself, which is toxic. So again, we have to look at how much processing our food is going through, because foods that go through a very high process are going to be a lot more toxic and are going to be or increase the amount of inflammation that we find in our diet. And that's obviously going to contribute to low back pain and the healing process, or lack of healing process, let's say, which is then going to contribute to further back pain. So in the next slide, we're going to look at the foods that reduce inflammation, and hopefully we can start readdressing this inflammatory balance. The foods that are then going to help reduce inflammation are whole foods, grains, beans, pulses, vegetables. Now that's any type of vegetable, but mainly we want to be focusing on the green ones. Low sugar fruits like avocados, tomatoes, lemons, limes. Healthy oils, so those are healthy fats, mono and polyunsaturated fats. Salts and water. So those 6 foods are going to be the ones that we need to start using to reduce inflammation. Now we could add to that herbs and spices as well, because that's going to help flavor our foods, but also they have a very sort of medicinal effect on the body. But with regards to like foods that we're going to be using a lot more, we have to first look at whole foods. So those are whole grains, beans, and pulses. So these haven't really had any processing to them. They've been produced and then they've been put into packaging. So they don't go through a large processing, because it's the processing that causes the damage to the food, which eventually is going to cause damage to our body. Next one is vegetables. Obviously, they are high in antioxidants, chlorophyll for the green ones especially, vitamins, and various different minerals as well. So again, those are the foods that basically build our immune system. Low sugar fruits. So the reason I say low sugar is because they are low in sugar, and obviously, as I've said, sugar increases the inflammatory aspect of let's say the healing process. So with regards to eating other fruits, there is nothing wrong with eating other fruits. We've just again got to be aware of how much that we're eating, because again, people will turn to fruit for their vitamins and minerals, but they won't necessarily look at them for their sugar content. So we could be eating low sort of processed and added sugar foods like baked goods, cakes, breads and things like that. So we could be eating low of that, but we could be eating a lot of fruit in its place. So our sugar content is still high, but we are taking in a few more vitamins and minerals. But the main thing with inflammation is the amount of sugar, because it's the sugar that causes the inflammation, because it's highly acidic and toxic to the body. Where it is taking in vitamins and minerals, it is still taking in a lot of sugar and inflammatory toxic materials. The next one is healthy oils. Like I said before, arthritis is sort of due to the joint not producing a lot of its fluid, and the fluid basically comes from healthy oils, because it's healthy oils that acts like the oil in your engine in your car. So every, say, 6 months to a year, you may replace or top up the oil in your car to keep the engine lubricated. Healthy oils do that for our joints, so they keep our joints lubricated. So if we can take in more healthy oils, we're going to reduce the amount of inflammation, we're going to reduce the amount of friction, we're going to reduce our chances of arthritis. Obviously, there are other contributing factors to arthritis, be it genetics, so on and so forth, but healthy oils are going to sort of put a little bit more in the favour of keeping healthy joints. Then we've got salts. Salts are our minerals: sodium, chloride, magnesium, potassium, phosphorus. All those different minerals, calcium is another one, all those minerals are going to contribute to keeping the healing process working. So high antioxidants, high mineral content of salts is going to help reduce the inflammation around joints, because again, as I've said, inflammation is highly acidic, or sugar is highly acidic. Those minerals are highly alkaline, so they're going to help balance out each other. And then the final one is water. Our body is 70% water. When joints become dehydrated, the discs can become dehydrated in the lower back, and therefore we can get degenerative diseases, as I've talked about with regards to the back. So again, if we can keep the water, the salts, and with regards to that, in fact, the salts and the water work together, because our body is a bag of salty water. So if we can put the salts and the water together, we're going to get much better results than just having water on its own or just having salt on its own. So again, we've got to get the balance right between all of these. So again, we've got to look at our diet, and we've got to understand and be very honest with how, let's say, healthy our diet is, and could we be doing better? Why are we eating these inflammatory foods? Is it because it's convenient? Is it because it's cheaper? And we have to start looking at foods that can help reduce the inflammation. Okay, so that brings us to a close of this little video presentation. I hope it's been helpful. I hope it's brought a little bit more of an insight into how you can reduce your low back pain. So it just leaves me to say thanks for watching. My name's Chris from ChristopherHole.com. I hope to see you on the website and in some future presentations.